implementation of the music that was on before the session, because it's reminded me, how many of you are Comcast cable customers? Short show of hands. The music was eerily similar to it, so I actually started having flashbacks to all those hours I've had on hold. So I'm going to try to push that away and then take you a little bit deeper into the discussion about the intersection of two kind of radical trends that are shaping the way that we're operating as an industry. And it was interesting that Jeff said at the outset, he used the reference to the fact that there is a tectonic shift. And I feel a little bit unworthy because I literally made it one lecture through Geology 101 before I decided it was the right thing for me. So I'm going to give you a perspective today and look forward to having follow-up discussions with folks, but I'll be very clear up front about kind of the nature of what I present. So this is my disclaimer. My first disclaimer, it was obvious from my bio, I am not a lawyer, I don't practice. I don't claim to practice or anything like that. I am expressing what is my viewpoint, not the viewpoint of OpenQ, but what I do want to say is that my particular perspective is influenced by the whole concept of being what I'll call a pragmatic technologist. I'm a big believer that technology can solve problems and that you need to always take a pragmatic approach to how that's taking place. And the last thing that I'll say is we'll talk about a bunch of different elements today, and ultimately what it will get down to when the rubber hits the road is that our experience with working with more than 40 different companies across the life sciences is that the nature of which they interpret compliance and regulatory issues and apply them to their own organization is often very proprietary. And personal to the company and idiosyncratic to the company. So I'm going to provide a perspective, but with those caveats ahead of time. So I want to take you through in the next 30 minutes or so a couple of different threads of a discussion. The first thread of the discussion that I want to talk about is trends in two different areas that have been referenced in the last panel discussion as well as earlier today. The first one is to talk about trends in off-label and quite frankly, let's call it the spectrum of feedback that I think folks have been seeing today. The second thing that I want to talk about is some trends associated with social, and I want to make the case for why social is going to become increasingly relevant in the life sciences in the coming years. And then I want to talk about some specific recommendations, and I'm going to look at it from kind of two different perspectives. The first perspective, and these will be kind of interwoven here, the first perspective is specific issues around off-label and its intersection with social, but I'm also going to take the opportunity, since we're talking about social, to talk about some general guidance based on the experiences that we've seen for companies who are thinking of taking on social responsibility. Listen to me. Taking on a social campaign of one way, shape, or form. So let's talk first about off-label and the trends in off-label, and I won't spend too much time on this because there's been a lot of discussion today associated with Caronia. It was funny, before I came up on stage, I was just reading the Arnold and Porter handout, and it referred to the ruling as a watershed event, and then my characterization from watching the district attorneys this morning was that they were pouring cold water on the concept. You can draw the analogy there. So I think that one of the things about Caronia is that it's something that might suggest a future change, but doesn't necessarily mean that there's any kind of imminent change right now. But a couple of things that were notable about it. The first is, as you think about the case itself, one of the interesting elements about it was that it was multiple unapproved uses were in the case fact. The second one is, at least in part, was around a speaker event that took place. And when the discussion took place, the discussion wasn't about the fact that it was truthful or non-misleading. It was really about the specific limitations about off-label, and hence the case discussion. If you read U.S. v. Caronia, the actual case, you'll see that there's tiebacks to the fact that off-label prosecution, one of the assertions made is off-label prosecution doesn't directly support the government's protection of public health, was one of the lifts out of the case. as well as the underlying act, is actually something that's allowed, so to speak. So there's the final finding of the case was that truthful, non-misleading statements about off-label use were protected by the First Amendment. And the reason I bring up all of this stuff is you think about kind of the trends in off-label. Is as I was kind of thinking about preparing for this presentation today, one of the things that I thought I would do is try to put a side-by-side comparison between Caronia and the Digiroi, which is my acronym for the draft guidance to industry regarding unsolicited requests of information. That was the best analogy that I could make associated with it. And go kind of side by side and look at some of the elements about what comes out of the case versus what came out of the guidance. And I won't go all the way through the discussion here today, except for to highlight, a number of kind of elements to this. One is you've got a draft guidance on one side. The most recent suggestion associated with Caronia is that the FDA has declined just in the last couple of days the decision to appeal. One, you've got a very limited geography that it's applicable to, which is the Second Circuit, versus a U.S. related circumstance. One, you're really talking about a fact pattern that had to do with HCPs, whereas the draft guidance explicitly takes a much larger perspective in terms of the population that's out there. One is really regarding a fact pattern associated with sales-led communication. The other one explicitly excludes sales out of it. And so, I think that the big issue that I would take away from here is it's not necessarily that one or the other is one where, again, I'm not an attorney, I can't point you to one standard or the other, but one of the things that I guess we walked away from as we were thinking about this is there's definitely a state of flux and complexity that we as an industry are wrestling with. And exactly where the standard is something that's going to be open to a lot of discussion and dialogue in the years ahead. And just to make it even more interesting in terms of its discussion, there's another case that's coming through that was referenced, I think, by one of the speakers this morning, which is U.S. versus Harkonnen and the Ninth Circuit, which has a slightly different fact pattern, but that's likely to have some implications associated with what are the relevant guidelines associated with off-label and the ability to limit off-label discussions. So we're left with, ultimately, again, I can't make a specific recommendation, but if I'm in your shoes when I'm wrestling with this, the concept of where's the exact line in terms of what's permissible in terms of the nature of dialogue that goes on either within a company or outside of the company. Is there a changing standard right now with respect to what I'll call permissive communication? And this is one of the points that I want to make associated with all of this, regardless of the state of whether or not the standard has changed or not, which is open to dialogue. Ultimately, one of the big takeaways that I would leave any folks with is if you look at the trends associated with off-label, one of the big clarion calls is the expectation that whatever nature of speech is going on, a company needs to be very vigilant in terms of an obligation associated with monitoring of that activity. And I'll get back to that concept of monitoring in just a moment. So one of the frameworks that I wanted to introduce as I was thinking about, and this will put a button on kind of the concept of the off-label trends, and we'll move into the area of social, is as looking at either the draft guidance or the fact pattern associated with Caronia, some of the different elements, as I tried to break this out into a framework, were what was the content involved, what was the catalyst associated with the communication, who was the communicator, what was the nature of the community, and then what was the intent associated with it. So you could think of this framework as 4CI. So as you're evaluating speech, these seem to be the variables that people would consider as they think about what could be permissive or what's not permitted. Now let me move quickly and we'll talk. So conclusion on the first one is where the standard is moving may very well be moving over the next couple of years, and there's a lot that's to be considered associated with that. But the ultimate conclusion or the ultimate recommendation is that any kind of dialogue, especially if the standard shifts, will be married with an expectation for increased monitoring of activity. So the second element, the second area I want to talk about is the concept of social media and where it stands within life sciences. And we present a lot at social conferences that we talk about digital media and the general trends associated with that. So I could make a huge slide deck that's just talking about how much social is changing the world, and there are some great charts that kind of talk about the fact that we're at the point now where people have more social accounts and they have email accounts. There's really kind of we're at a crosswise. But I thought that the best way that I would communicate kind of the pervasiveness of social is there was a nice journal article by Brian McGowan and a number of other folks where they took a survey of oncologists and primary care physicians, and they talked about kind of the consumption of social media, and then they also talked about the impact of social media. And the consumption of social media, they had both a kind of a daily statistic as well as a weekly statistic. And I like to think about the rhythm of a week. So two of the statistics that showed up were 61% were weekly consumers of social information, 46% of the people were weekly contributors to social, and this is professional social, not necessarily personal social activity. The other thing that I thought was interesting is in the course of this survey, and you can see it's an N of 485, so it's not a huge N, but it's pretty indicative of the state of kind of U.S. physicians. At around 60% cited the value of the information that they received via social mediums as either being increasing of their effectiveness of patient care or the quality of patient care. And so you could choose to look at this, and you can see the citation there, that article. You could look at any number of statistics or any number of articles that are out there, any number of industry trends. I guess the reality that I want to communicate to folks today is social is completely here already, and our obligation as organizations is to address the challenge of how to meet those physicians where they are and be social with them. And social, and the inherent challenge is that social is by definition not a one-way communication, which is often the way that we're used to communicating in a lot of ways, and it's much more iterative, and we'll get back to that in a minute. So one of the other points that I want to make associated with social is not only is it pervasive in terms of the community that we're trying to actively engage as an industry, but the second thing about it is that social is often misunderstood as being kind of this amorphous sense of one social, one size fits all. People talk a lot about Twitter and Facebook, but one of the things that we've seen as we've looked at the way that industry adopts social is that social can sometimes represent internal-only initiatives. Think about an internal Yammer or Chatter site where you're actually sharing information back and forth, perhaps only within a department or within the walls of the company. Then you've got social that might represent a private, invite-only community that you've created as an organization where you can truly control the walls around that nature of that dialogue, but that it does include people who are outside your company walls, if you will. And then you've got kind of true public social that's out there. And the point that I would make associated with this is a company that takes on social really needs to start seeing social as kind of increasing levels of communities that they need to engage, not just the Facebooks and Twitters of the world. Now, one of the things that I want to talk about, the implications of social, and it'll circle back to the concept of off-label, is one of the ways that I could to talk about it is make the comparison towards CRM and this CRM systems that are out there versus the implication of the nature of dialogue when you go social. So if you think about any of you who have gone through a CRM implementation recently, what you'll see a lot is the nature of your systems are set up that they're permissioned. They're firewalled so that different people can't communicate to other people. The second thing that you'll see with CRM, and we've been involved in CRM implementations is the concept of drop-downs, where it's not necessarily about typing information into the system, it's about actually choosing from a pick list or making a selection about what's the information that I actually want to enter into the system. Choose A, B, C, D, or E from that. And the last one is, a lot of people talk about CRM as reactive. So if you want to think about how the trends of social could shape the industry, now take a look at what social implications are in terms of the dialogue. First of all, social is network-centric. People who start up internal social networks will create their own networks and exchange information back and forth. A second component of social is it's very much about that concept of free text information going back and forth. And that issue alone represents a fundamental computing change in terms of the life sciences industry. And the last component is there's a predisposition within social to be a little bit more proactive in terms of not just the sharing of the information, but talking about events and activities and such. So I want you to think about the kind of computing that you're doing today and when you go back to your office. And for many of us, one of the things that we've seen is that if you take away email and you take away Microsoft Word and you think about the enterprise systems that you are involved in on a daily basis, free text has been eliminated from the world of the interaction from the enterprise. And that's a trend that as companies get more social, you will see a tremendous shift in that. It is impossible to go social and not embrace the concept of free and open text that shares information back and forth. And that is a fundamental challenge that the industry will face that I wanted to call out in terms of the major trends that are there. So social is coming, physicians want you to go social, but embedded within that is an expectation that there is a shift in terms of the way that information is managed and shared within corporations, that it's not about drop-downs anymore, not about choosing from the list. It really starts to be a lot more about the free interchange of information. Now let's talk about social compliance. I want to talk about it generally, in a general perspective, and then I want to talk about a couple of specific things about off-label and social. So the first thing is, when we work with companies, there's a lot of kind of sense of the fact that social compliance is this big amorphous concept. And so one of the things that we like to do is work with companies and break it down into individual specific concerns. So if you were to try to create a framework, if you will, one framework that we would propose is think about it in terms of the risks that you have associated with the disclosure of information, the company indications within social that could take place that indicate company conduct, individual employee conduct, and then one of the big areas that I think has not received a lot of treatment these days is the concept of privacy. And so if you are in the compliance or regulatory function and you're thinking about creating your social policy, and our recommendation is you actually probably have at least two that govern user-generated content as well as company-generated content, is that you really think about all four of these components as part of what your overall compliance framework. And this just gives you kind of a couple of examples as you think about privacy, personally identifiable information. You know, I'll give you a for instance, let's say that you're a medical device company and somebody shares an X-ray on social and doesn't cut the identifier out. Now all of a sudden you've got a risk in terms of sharing of that person's information. So those kind of considerations are out there. So as people think about taking on the challenge of how do I address my company is going social, how do I address the specific challenges, another thing that we do is we like to break it down into, you know, again, I'm a practical technologist. What are some of the practical common challenges that companies are trying to do? And so I wanted to share with you is, you know, as you take on this as an organization, what are some of the business problems day to day that we would expect that you'll try to deal with? One of them is identify risks and liabilities from posts violating a company or policy at the individual post or topic level. So I open up a dialogue, People start posting information. What's the way that I can identify potential risk that's out there? Another area that is a common challenge that you see folks having is sharing of files. If I have files that are being shared, those files, in addition to the posts, might have potential liability for my organization. There's a lot of information inside that needs to be scanned for that. You also have issues associated with security of information. You might have people who are turning on social networks internally, and the compliance challenge that they're worried about is not just I'm going to have people chattering back and forth within an organization, but now all of a sudden that might take place in a mobile setting, and I'm worried about once that information goes to a mobile device, now it might leave the organization and I lose control of that content. And then lastly, you have people who are concerned specifically about archiving messages and files. So some of the different elements in terms of common use cases, but I guess I have 3 or 4 kind of overall themes that I wanted to highlight today, and this is one, which is, our sense is that the social revolution is here, it's undeniable, and that the best way that organizations can take it on is to assume it's going to happen and adjust for it. And that the biggest expectation associated with that is that companies are now going to take on a greater level of responsibility for monitoring social networks. So if you take on a social network in any way, shape, or form, and you'll see in a moment, you can decide the boundaries of where you're going to monitor, you need to make sure that you're taking on not just the concept of the network, but the obligation for monitoring that network for potential compliance violations. So the first thing I want to do is, as we talk about social, I actually want to make a plug, which is I talked about the fact that free text was kind of coming back if you go into the social world. We actually have been talking with companies about the fact that that's a good trend, because the challenge associated with choosing a pick list is that it's inherently limiting in terms of the information that people can enter into the system. And if they have to choose between 2, neither of those 2 options may best represent what actually took place. So it's our belief that by creating tools that allow for more social activity and more free text, what you're actually, as a compliance person, you're getting the benefit of is that more of the conversations that you need to make sure that you're watching are going to be conversations that are going to be taking place in forums that can be more effectively monitored. So it's our belief that the fundamental shift towards social and towards more free text is also something that's more favorable in terms of compliance, because you'll get more of a sense of the dialogue instead of it taking place offline. Now, let's talk a little bit about the concept associated with listening, and I would put it into a certain context. So anybody who turns on a social network needs to understand that, or engage a social network in an active way, needs to think about what they're listening, taking on an obligation to listen or monitor to the dialogue. They need to know what they're listening for, and I'll get back to that in a second. And finally, they need to make sure that they're in a position to appropriately respond, and we'll talk about these different elements here quickly. So first, one of the points that I want to make here is that when we talk, I talked at the outset about the fact that social networks have kind of an increasing radius, if you will, from private company to private networks that include external parties but are still walled off to truly public. One of the things that as a company thinks about the listening, the obligation associated with listening can vary associated with that. What I mean, for example, is there's no specific stipulation anywhere that a company has an obligation to listen to everything that's out there on Facebook. But I would contend that if you have a network that you've created or you're actively involved in, then you do take on that listening and monitoring responsibility for your own purposes of making sure that the behavior that's taking place on that network that is inspired by your individuals is compliant. So let me give kind of four kind of overall recommendations associated with social, or some some general recommendations that I'll tie into Offlabel to close out the presentation today. These are things that, again, as we see and we talk to companies, we talk about the fact that social isn't this kind of monolithic activity, that it's multifaceted to it, and there are a couple of important nuances that as you take on social compliance you need to be aware of. The first is, we've talked about already, which is the concept that there are multiple social channels that are out there. Any policy that you create, any action that you undertake needs to be cognizant of the fact that you're bringing in any kind of monitoring scheme, you're bringing in information from multiple social sources. It could be chat, or it could be Yammer, it could be your company's controlled Facebook, it could be a Twitter feed that's out there. The second one is that the concept of social needs to be policy driven. And what I mean there is that ultimately what you're looking for is policy violations, and those particular policy violations may vary from channel to channel that's out there. The third area we've already talked about, so I'll move through that quickly, is the concept of shared content. One of the things that we've frequently seen is that folks who are worried about social compliance often focus on the 140 characters associated with the Twitter feed and forget the fact that a file could be posted and attached to that message, and ultimately the real problematic information could be inside that attached file. And then the last component is, again, on the belief that ultimately we're moving to a world which is going to be more open and sharing of information. The best thing that an organization can do is have a means by which they can both identify the problem and then appropriately document and respond to it. And that response may be a direct response, or it might be a documentation that something is a false positive. So this is just a quick slide to give you a sense of the concept of multi-channel. So as we talk with companies, if you're thinking about social compliance, you may have a chatter instance, you may have a private site where you have your KOLs involved, you may have a company application, or you may have public social, and each of those may be components that you want to monitor and listen to in terms of ensuring that your company's behavior is compliant. The second component is the concept of multiple policies. One of the things that when we approach the concept of social compliance, often we draw the analogy to antivirus. If you think about antivirus, antivirus has different viruses that are out there that have a signature of what that potential violation is. And the best means for a company to think about how they identify those potential risks is to start with what is their policies that they have that are out there, how do they translate into SOPs, and then how do those translate into actual signatures of violations that they'll look for in a social network that's out there. It might be a specific reference, like a reference to a competitor. It might be, for example, in an adverse event, a reference to both a brand as well as a physical condition, as well as a reporter who's associated with it and an identifiable individual. So the concept of looking for social violations needs to be thought of as something that is specific on a policy in a specific basis, where a company starts with their policies and then decides based on that, what am I monitoring for, what am I listening for? And one of the things that we've definitely seen as an organization is, as you think about an infrastructure for monitoring, it's not as simple as I'm going to have a person now who's going to read every post that's out there, and it's not as simple as I'm just going to look for keywords that are referenced out in the internet or in my internal company network. That there are more and more sophisticated technologies for identifying the language and patterns of potential violations, and so that companies need to think about, and the volume, quite frankly, can become so overwhelming that there's no way that you can read through every single entry that's out there. And so you need a tool that's not just looking for keywords, but you're looking for the signature and the patterns of potential violations that are out there. Likewise, policy variance for an organization may very well vary associated with the, if you will, the locus of the network that you're associated with. You may have some specific policies that you have applicable to within a company's walls, other policies that you want to enforce in terms of social activity, in terms of a private network, and other policies that are really specific to just public social activity. And so a company that builds a social policy needs to accommodate the fact that what type of network could very well determine what you're monitoring for, what your potential risks are. And we've already talked about this. One of the biggest exploits that we've seen in social, and any of you who are not technologists, I would encourage you to press your technology people on, is the fact that the concept of content that's shared is a big area of potential exposure for organizations. So as you think about any policy or any technology that you have that encourages social, you need to think about how attached files could or could not be utilized, shared using those social platforms. Our general predisposition and recommendation to companies is turn off the concept of shared files if you have the ability to, at least at the outset, because it represents kind of a real sharing of a large volume of information that becomes more difficult to monitor. And then the last component that I would share with folks today is the concept of a workflow. If you only walk away with 3 or 4 kind of observations from the discussion today, I'd want to make sure that you see that there's the shifting world is definitely pointing us towards the object of that social is here to stay, that social creates an obligation to monitor, and that the final component is that when you monitor, monitoring is just the beginning of the challenge that you're taking on. Ultimately, the organizations that we've seen that are the most effective are the ones that have built a response workflow in place so that if something takes place, they have a documented means by which they would respond to it. And it may very well vary associated with the type of policy that's been violated. But you want to have a situation where you know that if a post like this takes place, you're going to remove it and quarantine it. Whereas if you have a posting that might be related to this subject matter, our response as an organization, given that particular locus or that particular network, is to respond. And to post something else on that social network or encourage people in that posting to go to another source of information. So the concept of establishing a workflow ahead of time and documenting that workflow so that when something takes place that's either a false positive or an actual violation, you're actually documenting to folks how you're actually responding to it. And I think that's the last element that I want to talk about today. I have a resources slide here which I want to make a kind of a quick pitch for, which is there are a number of sources out there I'd recommend folks take a look at if you're looking in the world of social compliance. One is there's a great monograph by Robert McHale that's out there. There's an organization that OpenQ is part of called the Social Media Compliance Council that's looking to put together best practices regarding social compliance, and there are 2 other organizations that have some really cogent thinking around social, the Coalition for Healthcare Communication and the Digital Health Coalition. So I'd recommend that you take a look at that. Obviously everything has to be tailored for your own company circumstances, and with that I want to say thank you very much for the time, and hope that you have a great rest of the evening. Any questions? No questions? All right, thank you for letting me off, and it's the last presentation before social hour.